It's the worst nightmare of every new author. Is my first chapter boring the reader? But in this video, I'm going to give you the 4 things you need to look for to know if your chapter is boring the reader, and I'm going to tell you how to fix them so that your chapter grabs the reader and makes them want to read the whole rest of the book. It can be really hard because the book is your baby. Like, you don't want to look at it and say, that's a really ugly, boring baby. But if you can take a step back and really look at it with a more critical eye, you can know whether your first chapter is boring, and then use these tools to fix it. Now, trust me, I am the queen of boring first chapters. I wrote 10 books in 8 years before I sold my first one. But once I figured this out, my career took off. But I'm here to share the tricks of the trade that I have learned over all these years of writing books so that you can write a compelling book and have a career that you're like, oh my gosh, I can't believe so many of my books are out there in readers' hands. The number one thing you need to look for, and the most common thing that most writers are doing, is a backstory dump. What is backstory? It is the history of your character, short and sweet. It's everything that they went through before the book took place. And while, yes, it has a huge bearing on them as a character, and I talk about that in a lot of these videos in the character playlist, you don't need to give the reader all of that right away because the reader doesn't care about them yet. They're not intrigued, they're not connected, they do not have a reason to know about it. I want you to think about it like being in the line at the grocery store. Your cart is full. All you want to do is get through the line, get out, get home, cook some dinner, and put on Netflix. But then you've got some person standing next to you talking about their whole life story and telling you everything about their cousin in Idaho and their dog. And you're thinking, I don't care. I don't know you. I don't care. That's essentially what a backstory dump at the beginning of a book does. And let me show you an example of what a backstory dump would be. Joe grew up in Wisconsin and left home at 17. He traveled the US for 10 years before finally settling down in Canada. He got a job at a bait shop, and that was where he met Anna on a fishing trip one day. He married her, and they had 2 beautiful kids who were carbon copies of them. Now, if you followed that paragraph up with a line like, and then he found a dead body, that would be a little bit more exciting. But the problem is readers make a decision on whether to buy a book within the first 3 sentences. They look at that beginning and they're like, ugh, I don't care about Joe. I just want to get to the good stuff. And so if you're not grabbing them right away and you're just dumping all this history on the page to start out, they're probably not going to pick your book up. Let me give you an example of one that does it right, that has that little bit of intrigue at the same time as dropping in just a hint of backstory. That's the key, a hint of backstory, not the whole history. The yacht appeared 9 weeks after Israel returned to his father's house, and even from a distance and under the squeezed red sun of dawn, he could see that the vessel was in trouble, adrift, rudderless, a possession of the sea rather than a partner of it. The only backstory you have in there is that Israel has returned to his father's house and that this ship showed up 9 weeks later. You don't know why he came back. You don't know where his father's house is, but you're intrigued. So the reader is already like, what's going on? Why is that ship adrift? And what is he going to find on it? Look at the difference between he grew up in Michigan and left home at 17 and the yacht appeared 9 weeks after Israel returned to his father's house. This book was so amazing. I could barely put it good, and I cared about Israel from the very first page. What happens is he goes aboard this ship and he begins to find dead bodies. But how Israel looks at that is very different than how somebody else might write it if they're writing a boring first chapter. But I will get to that in a second. The second mistake is not making the characters come to life. It's super hard to do, I get that, but it happens a lot where the characters are just kind of flat on the page. They're not engaging, and thus the reader doesn't care about them. Do you see a common thread there? Something like, I started scuba diving when I was 10, and although it scared me to go underwater, I knew it would come in handy someday. Today, I was diving into a dark lake wearing a wetsuit. It was a little scary because it was so dark. That example is not like super bad, but it's not super good either. Let's look at how Lisa Gardner did it in the first chapter of Before She Disappeared. The water feels like a cold caress against my face. I kick deeper down into the gloom, my long hair trailing behind me like a dark eel. I'm wearing clothes, jeans, tennis shoes, a t-shirt topped with an open windbreaker that wings out and slows my descent. My clothing grows heavier and heavier till I can barely flutter my legs, work my arms. What is Lisa Gardner doing there? Let's talk about that. For one, she has no backstory, absolutely no backstory. We don't know when or why this girl is scuba diving or swimming or any of this. We know nothing about that. But the other thing that she is doing is creating a sense of impending danger for this character. You're worried about this character before you've even gotten to know her, which is exactly what I'm talking about with strong characterization from the very first page. Because this is a suspense novel, we do not know if this is the private investigator or the dead girl that's in this book. But either way, you're just like, I gotta see if she makes it out. And that's from the first paragraph. Lisa Unger's Close Your Eyes and Count to 10 has a very short prologue, but then chapter 1 does really, really good characterization. She is excellent at making these people come to life on the very first page. Blake slouched beside Adele, holding a frosty blue ice pack to the bridge of his swelling nose. He'd already handed her his shattered glasses, and she held them in the palms of her hands like a wounded baby bird. We don't know who Blake is. We don't know who Adele is. We know that something has happened to Blake, and she really cares about him because she's holding those glasses like a wounded baby bird. That paints a picture right away of these people that we don't even know yet. That's exactly what you want to do with your first chapter, is to paint a picture of a strong character from the very first page. The third thing you're going to want to look for in your very first chapter is stakes. Something has to be important enough to get the reader to turn the pages. That example that I had with the guy that grew up in Michigan, what's important about that? Nothing. We're just telling his life story. Nobody cares. There's nothing at stake, literally. When you have something at stake, the reader gets super invested because they want to see how it turns out. Just like the woman diving into the lake, you want to make sure she gets out and she doesn't. Somebody asked me when I was at PubsherCon last week, can I start with the weather? Because I've heard that's a no-no and that's a really bad way to start. You can actually start with the weather if you use it to raise the stakes on the very first page. Let me give you an example of the weather done badly in a way that does not raise the stakes. The storm blew in after 5 and shook the trees. The rain fell in heavy sheets. It soaked the ground and filled. It made the electricity go out, and that was scary for her. Now, yeah, there's a little bit of stakes there. The power went out, but is that really good stakes, or is that just mess stakes? Because you want really good stakes right from the beginning. In Lucy Foley's The Guest List, the book goes back and forth between the present day and the past. The very first chapter is in the present day, the wedding night, because this whole thing takes place at a wedding. Here's how she uses the weather. The lights go out. In an instant, everything is in darkness. The band stop their playing. Inside the tent, the wedding guests squeal and clutch at one another. The light from the candles on the table only adds to the confusion, sends shadows racing up the canvas walls. It's impossible to see where anyone is or hear what anyone is saying. Above the guests' voices, the wind rises in a frenzy. So we are just as scared as the guests right in that beginning. We don't even actually have a character on the page per se. We just have a group of. And when she uses the storm, it is a metaphor for what is going on with this murder. That outside a storm is raging. It shrieks around them. It batters the tent. At each assault, the whole structure seems to flex and shudder with a loud groaning of metal. The guests cower in alarm. The doors have come free from their ties and flap at. And then you've got this really clever turn of phrase where she says, the flames of the paraffin torches that illuminate the doorway snicker. That's a little bit scary, right? Or a little bit evil, that the candle flames are snickering. They're kind of laughing at what. Those are high stakes. These people are in serious danger. They're outside in a tent and this storm is just coming and they're all terrified. So right there on that first page, we know there are stakes. The fourth thing that your first chapter absolutely has to do is connect with the reader. If you've grabbed them with a really great hook at the beginning, like the lights, then you've got to carry it through by having a chapter that really delivers on that. That means you don't just write this really cool, exciting ending and then just go back into he grew up in Michigan and, he traveled. They want to continue to be hooked and then be so hooked at the end of the chapter that they go on to the next. For instance, in the Michael Carita book, Israel goes on the ship and he finds these dead bodies, and it's really cool how Michael Carita does that. He gets on the boat and he realizes right away his mind had accepted what his body already knew. There was no one alive. He'd come to count the dead. And then he literally does. And we see each of the bodies as he's already found 2 dead men. And then he finds 2 more murdered men in a stateroom. So now it's 4 dead men. Then he finds a man dead in the shower. 5 dead. Another paragraph. He goes to the crew's cabin. He finds another dead person. 6 dead. He goes up to the pilot house, finds another one. This is every paragraph is another dead. And it's really intriguing. You're wondering why he's looking at this through such a calm and dispassionate lens. Like, why is he not more startled by all of it? The police and the FBI question him, and this is where Michael Carita ends on an amazing hook. He talks about talking with the FBI agent, and then he says it was not his role to volunteer information. All he had to do was answer questions honestly. New paragraph. He would tell them no lies. And then the ending sentence, all by itself, really powerful. It was not up to him to make sure they asked the right questions. That is intrigue. That leaves the reader with a question. What's going to happen next? What do you mean they didn't ask the right? And that's exactly the kind of thing that makes the reader turn the page because you want to know what are the right questions? What happened here? Why is he so cold and dispassionate? Lucy Foley does a similarly brilliant thing where she really increases the suspense by putting in the elements of this wedding that is happening. Just before the storm hit, the bride and groom were cutting the cake. But Lucy Foley doesn't describe it like that. That's what I mean about leaving questions and creating. Only minutes before the lights went out, the guests gathered around to watch its ceremonial disemboweling. Now the deep red sponge gate. Disemboweling, deep red sponge, that is like showing you a murder without showing you a murder. Then the storm comes back because she circled back. Then from outside comes a new sound. You might almost mistake it for the wind, but it rises in pitch and volume until it is unmistakable. The guests freeze. They stare at one another. They are suddenly afraid again, more so than they were when the lights went out. They all know what they are hearing. It is a scream of, "You left there?" What question does she leave you with? Well, who the heck is screaming? Why are they screaming? What is going on? You're just as bewildered and confused and intrigued as the guest. And what that does is it makes you feel like you're right there. And when you look back at your chapter 1, look first for the backstory dump. It is the most common mistake that I see. Then look secondly for whether you are bringing that character to life with some vivid showing, not telling. I have a whole video on showing, not telling right here where I taught. Then start looking at what's at stake here. Is it something? One of the things you might ask is, does that have to be the catalyst for the whole story? Do I have to kick off everything in chapter 1? Yes and no. It's really a matter of personal choice there. A book starts in the middle of a character's life, so you can start in their ordinary world, but something still has to be at stake. Almost every day we all have something at stake, right? Getting the kids to school on time, trying not to get fired at our job, dealing with an overbearing parent, whatever it may be. There's almost always something at stake in our ordinary life. So even if you're starting there, your character would have something at stake that is important. But it's even better if you can tie what is at stake into the plot because that gets the reader connected to the plot. And then you want to create that it's about building that emotional base with the character so that the reader relates to them and feels like they are right there with them, that these have become friends. Whether they like them or not, because you can do that with a villain as well as a protagonist, that's another story. But when you have a connection, the reader cares and they keep turning the pages. That's a lot for one little chapter to do. I totally agree. What you need to do is study really well done chapter 1s. Study them over and over and over again, and then take a step back from your own work. Maybe set it aside for a couple weeks or a month. Don't look at it. And then compare it to what you've just read with these really powerful first chapters. And the final tip I have for you is one I tell people all the time. You have to trust your gut. Your gut knows from reading a lot of books whether this is boring or not. It really does. Sometimes we don't want to listen because that means revisions, and revisions are not always fun. But if your gut is saying, you're fine, or if you find you are skipping parts of your book, those are the boring parts. They need to go. They need to be either rewritten or complete. Tell me in the comments what you struggle with the most in your first chapter and what you admire most about the great first chapters that you read. What is it that you see other authors doing that's really incredible that you want to learn how to do? Because I'm more than happy to talk about on how to write. And in the meantime, check out this video here on how to show, not tell, because that will really help you bring all of these things to life in your first chapter and make it absolutely